If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 591, Nemea Style. Hephaestus pouted but didn't fuss over the matter and let Nick focus on this since she was eager to learn a new crafting method. With Zeus no doubt trying to improve his power for the inevitable rematch between them, she wanted greatly to improve her own power to keep up. It may be Nick's fate to have the final clash with Zeus, but she could at least hold off her father until he was ready. With that said, however, she turned her attention to the domain that she had that was starting to lag behind her crafting domain considerably, her metal domain. It was only after clashing with Zeus that she realized that it countered his lightning domain innately. This revelation enlightened her of a lot of things that she had been confused about before. First amongst them was why Zeus always punished her harshly for any improvements to her power she made previously. It wasn't because he hated that she was born a woman, but rather that he was afraid of her becoming able to throw him off his throne. This explained why Athena was treated with reverence after she was born with what was also considered male domains, yet she was spiked and scorned. Nick didn't know about the goddess's thoughts, but even if he didn't, he would probably agree with her. He hadn't ever met Zeus himself, but from the context he had of the god's cruelty to suppress a possible threat in the future sounded right up his alley. Now to see what this new crafting style is going to be. Nick thought, shaking his head to remove any distracting thoughts. Spending his free draw, Nick watched as the roulette wheel spun for a minute before finishing and landing on Nemea Style. Nick wasn't familiar with the name, but considering the same could be said of his other two styles before he got them, that wasn't a big deal. Like usual, the wheel turned into rainbow-colored mist that flowed into his head, giving him the knowledge of the style in great detail. Immediately Nick had an odd look on his face, as this style was suspiciously perfect for him. The basics of the style involved taking the spiritual energy of two types of souls that appear diametrically opposed in nature and fusing them together inside an object to create a sort of symbiotic artificial soul that took on the true properties of the one it was bonded to. The final result was a weapon unique to its wielder that was known as a Zanpakuto. The thing was, however, that this style couldn't even be considered magical at all, and thus even muggles could have Zanpakutos and grow powerful as a result, because the weapons were almost entirely based on the power of one's soul and body. In other words, Nick could finally arm his people in a sustainable manner. Enchanted items were all well and good, but they were static and could only perform at a consistent level without any improvement unless they had growth attributes. Adding those to every piece of equipment made, however, was costly and horribly inefficient, so Nick refused to do it. It wasn't all good news, however, as there was a very large problem with this new style. The two types of souls that were needed to make the Zanpakutos didn't exist naturally in this world. Hollows and soul reapers simply weren't a thing in this world, and as a result needed to be carefully and artificially created. Nick had finally ran out of luck in terms of crafting styles being compatible with his world. The previous two were unorthodox approaches to this world's natural order, but still fell within it and thus could be integrated easily. This one, however, required a thing that didn't exist at all, which made the situation delicate. Unlike in the world in which this new style came from, souls in this world don't naturally hang around after death before becoming hollows or soul reapers. Rather, they go directly to the afterlife in the underworld or slip into the unknown. Messing with this process to create hollows and soul reapers was massively risky. In the best case, the world would accept this new change and those type of souls would start appearing naturally, which would cause huge problems for literally everyone. According to the information that came with the style, these souls all had the potential to grow to the point of unleashing nuke levels of destructive force via either training or just surviving and consuming enough. The worst case scenario was that the world itself directly rejects the interference and smites Nick for his attempt. This wasn't a simply harsh punishment either, but the world directly trying to erase him. Chapter 592, Nemea Style, 2. Thankfully, the system had a solution to this in the form of spiritual energies and special jewels from both types of souls. The only issue Nick had was that these jewels were bloody expensive. Each one was 500,000 points, and even though his current works earned him about 700 system points each these days, that was nearly his whole stock at the moment. Sadly, Nick could only swallow the pain of the purchase, as this new style was far too useful to the current him to ignore. It wasn't actually that bad since Nick could just make the points back in time, but it didn't mean that getting set back to dead broke was a fun experience. Nick looked at the two jewels he bought and couldn't help but admit that they were quite beautiful. The one containing Soul Reaper type spiritual energy was a brilliant azure blue, and swirled like moving clouds were contained within it. The hollow jewel, however, was a vibrant mix of red, green, yellow, purple, and black that, much like the other jewel, swirled but this time chaotically. Oddly, Nick felt almost drawn to the hollow energy, as though it was a missing part of himself that he wasn't aware was missing. Searching deeply, he quickly realized that this yearning came from his Daedric nature, and he figured out why it was acting like this. Hollows were created when a being with a soul died and they lingered in the world of the living for too long. Contrary to what many believed, souls can in fact pass on without assistance from a soul reaper in that world, but without that aid many became hollows because dying didn't come with a what's next brochure. Soul reapers were the souls that successfully pass on to the spiritual world either with or without assistance. Anyways, hollowified souls were in a way transformed into primal beings that followed their baser instincts in order to grow more powerful. This unfortunately meant they consumed spiritual energy, usually by eating other souls. The reason Nick's Daedric nature was acting the way it was because hollows were in essence very similar to Daedra but were also different enough that they would want to combine to create a more perfect being. Nick honestly wasn't sure if he should do so, however, as there was no telling what he would become. This was an unprecedented situation, as never before had a Daedra encountered hollow energy, and the reverse was also true. While all evidence pointed to a positive outcome, there was no guarantee that was truly the case. I am willing to take this risk, but I should inform everyone before I do, just in case. Nick thought as he stood up to go find Hephaestus. It had taken him a couple days to digest the information he got from the new style, as it covered a broad range of knowledge that was new. Not only highly advanced stuff but even basics of things as seen from that world, such as spiritual energy composition and manipulation. In addition to the knowledge he had before getting this style, Nick was willing to bet heavily that he was the most knowledgeable about souls, or at least the second most knowledgeable in the world. With this new understanding, however, Nick also had the understanding of just how crude his experiments with souls previously had been. It was frankly embarrassing, as he might as well have been a child smashing two types of food together in hopes of getting a tasty treat. Spiritual energy was so much more complex than that, and it was hard to reconcile the sheer difference in understanding from before he got this new style with the new one. Hephaestus was on the moon in the new crafting room when Nick found her. She was in the middle of an experiment involving mixing a runic enchantment with light materials, so he waited until she was done before making himself known. She failed but didn't look bothered by it, and even smiled happily when she saw Nick. "I take it you have completed this new style?" she asked eagerly. Nick nodded and roughly explained it to her, while leaving out or altering some details slightly so that the true origin of the style didn't get revealed accidentally. "I also made a bit of a breakthrough in regards to my own race and might be unavailable for quite some time as I implement the changes to myself," Nick finally said, and the goddess looked concerned. "Is it dangerous?" she asked with a concerned look, and Nick shrugged helplessly. "I do not know," he said honestly. Chapter 593, Secret Function and Message. Nick found it rather odd that the system itself seemed to be pushing his race towards an unknown direction. This might seem like a matter of coincidences, but if you were to put it together, even at the start when he received the Celebrimbor style, the system had an error where Nick started to turn into an elf. That was the first suspicious point in and of itself, as despite receiving an additional 2 more styles, nothing similar had happened. Perhaps that made sense for the Twilight style, but the new one was literally made by a pure spiritual being for pure spiritual beings. The second suspicious point was that the system just so happened to give a Daedra heart as a mission reward when he started planning to under the ritual of nature. Afterwards, his own essence had taken on a Daedric nature to a small degree as a result. His wand could be considered an actual coincidence, since the system had no part in that, and the celestial bird's spirit fragment mixing with his race was a part of that. The final suspicious part was that out of the nigh infinite books that the system had, he happened across the Daedric book that explained how to bind a realm to oneself. One should keep in mind that this was certifiably Tier 7 knowledge based on what Hephaestus told him, so he should never have come across it normally so early. Now he learns that the very type of spiritual energy he needed to use the new style he got just so happened to be compatible for upgrading his race again. He wasn't buying it. "I know you can hear me, system, I want an explanation," Nick demanded, and for a few moments he had begun to think that he was just being paranoid. "So the jig is up, I take it. Don't bother replying, since this is a message I left for you. Should you notice the secret function of your system I gave you?" The system put up a line of text in Nick's vision that made his eyes narrow. He had always assumed that something must have interfered with his soul after he died originally, as otherwise he wasn't sure how he ended up in this world with a system no less. Now he truly knew that he was here by design and that his current situation was part of this being's plan. "You are probably thinking something along the lines of me having controlled your actions for a very specific goal until now, right? Don't answer, I already know, perks of being a higher dimensional entity and all that. Honestly though, you are entirely wrong. See, I placed you in that world and gave you the system to entertain myself. Eternity is quite boring after all. That whole idea is pointless if you are a puppet, as then I will always know how things will turn out. Anyways, I got a bit off topic there, so let's get back to the real meat and potatoes of the situation, the secret function of the system I gave you. See, the system functions as a sort of special cheat just for you, so long as you put in the effort to make the most of it, which I am assuming you have if you are reading this. The secret function though was a little surprise I added to see what you end up with in the end. The system is designed with the inclination to push racial improvement options compatible with the current you into view. That's right, actually taking those options is entirely on you, as all the system does is make them known to you. As an added bonus, I made sure that the things that pop up are only those with a high chance of success, since you dying at the first one is rather boring. That's it for this message, and remember, I'm rooting for you at all times. The text ended and Nick was left more confused than when he started reading it. The message left him with more questions than it answered, but at least he knew how he got to this world now. More likely than not it was some sort of unfathomable eldritch being that exists outside the known dimensions. At least it is good to know that I am not being controlled, or can I even trust the words of something capable of all this? Ugh, I have so many bloody questions and doubts now. Nick thought, conflicted with this new understanding of his situation. In the end, Nick chose to just try and ignore this new information, as it literally made no difference at all if he focused on it or not. Chapter 594, Something New. Or at least that was what he tried to do, but that sort of news was rather hard not to focus on. Thankfully something happened that distracted him from it, as Hephaestus created a crude asachi, a weapon soul, in a way that was blank until the essence of one's soul was imprinted on it. Hephaestus was not happy with the way it turned out, however, as the thing was barely functional and prone to violent outbursts against its creator, which was a sign of mistakes having been made in the creation process. In this case, an incorrect ratio of hollow and soul reaper energy, with there being too much hollow energy. Nick explained this, and the goddess didn't hesitate to dismantle the asachi to try again, while Nick took a bit of the excess hollow energy for himself. The energy was surprisingly obedient when he took it into his essence. A day later, Nick still hadn't noticed much of a change in himself and thought it was because he hadn't used enough energy. It was at that point, however, that his entire soul quivered in pain. Apparently the hollow energy was waiting in the part of his essence tied to his mana, and that part had been hit with his domain transition at this moment. The previously converted energy was rapidly changed again as the hollow energy spread and corrupted it. The more was converted, the greater the pain Nick felt as his essence began to clash and shift within itself and shrink down. With this transformation came a violent and savage hunger that had Nick turn his attention to the souls in his realm that he was saving. Nick acted on instinct and began to consume the raw souls directly, which eased the hunger he felt and let his mind return to clarity. Hollow instincts are no bloody joke, he thought in horror at what he did while out of it. It was a violent and savage action that made him feel almost tainted for doing it. The hunger suddenly vanished the moment the transformation of his essence was complete, and the realm surprisingly doubled in size immediately afterwards. Nick found this odd, as he didn't feel like his power had improved so much, and the transition of his mana to his domain's energy was still ongoing, though now the change was also into hollow-like energy as well. His essence was denser though, but it certainly didn't feel as though that made any difference from before at all. The transformation had however caused his Daedric body to break down into energy, however, so Nick had to recreate it again, but that was when he discovered a difference. The new body looked almost the same as before, but had a few differences. The first was that it was larger and more muscular. It was as though the original body had hit a major growth spurt and also packed on muscle at the same time. The second change was that the body had a tail now that was a bit like a mix of a serpent and a bird, as it was long and slender but had small feathers along its whole length and a fan of large ones at the tip. The third change, however, was in the form of a white bone-like mask covering the mouth and jawline of the face, with rows of sharp predatory teeth clear to see, A/N, think horrible. The final change was the one that interested Nick the most, however, as the body had glowing energy channels snaking across its entire form that gave the whole thing a sinister vibe. Thanks to the knowledge that came with the crafting style, Nick could tell what parts came from the hollow side of things, but these energy channels didn't belong to any part of any of his previous races, so he assumed it was part of his new one. Controlling this new body was an interesting thing as well for Nick, as he felt almost without limit while doing so. The body also came with a new innate ability that made him slightly annoyed: soul devouring and manipulation. Nick could now grab a raw soul with his bare hands while in this body and even consume it in order to grow his power, much the same way a hollow would. It was very similar to his netherworld grasp, but didn't allow him to modify a soul that he was holding, so the artifact could still have its own uses. Casting magic with this new body was also not only very easy but even seemed to amplify its effects slightly. The body had a trait that Nick knew would be irritating to deal with as well, since it could regenerate on its own in next to no time at all. Chapter 595, Zanpakuto. Nick was honestly rather surprised at how little changed from his race getting upgraded. Besides a minor cosmetic adjustment to his Daedric body alongside a couple new abilities that he technically could have done in some manner beforehand, there was nothing really different. Now that I think about it, Hollows and Daedra were very similar to begin with, so I suppose a small transformation was to be expected, he thought before moving his attention onto mastering the new style himself. Hephaestus had a head start in this regard, but Nick knew he had an advantage since he had a great many tips and hints with his system given knowledge that she did not. The guy who made this style was unbelievably knowledgeable and had left a great deal of this knowledge in the inheritance that Nick has. While almost all of it could be applied to the crafting process, so much seemed off topic that Nick couldn't explain it to Hephaestus properly without showing it. For example, that one could create a more powerful personal Zanpakuto by adding a part of themselves during the forging process. While the Asachi was the same either way, the bond between the wielder and weapon was tighter and more intimate this way. Speaking of Asachi, Nick also knew that it was possible to have fully manifested Zanpakuto spirits without owners so long as they were provided the energy they needed to exist. Ironically, there was even a side note about this in the style where the guy who created it bragged about being the closest anyone came to learning the secondary release state of Zanpakuto that was called Bankai long before the first person actually reached that point. The reason it was ironic was because despite this, the creator of the style never even considered that a second release was possible before it actually happened. Nick couldn't blame him, since from what he knew of the creation and imprinting process of the Zanpakuto, learning the name of the weapon gave it its true form, which should logically be its final one as well, but it was not. The creator himself even left a comment on this, stating how even after thousands of years creating Zanpakuto he hadn't fully understood every aspect of them, as occasionally someone would find a new detail that was previously unknown. A good example would be the case of introspection, in which a soul reaper would become so in tune with their weapon spirit that the two entities would fuse into one. The result was an increase in power by more than several fold if done correctly. The creator of the style did note that there was a trend in these discoveries, as the one who found them always got a large boost in power. He also noted that besides Bankai he hadn't been able to achieve introspection due to his attachment to each Zanpakuto he created. He simply couldn't devote his all to a single weapon as a craftsman, which was a thing Nick understood personally. To most craftsmen, their creations were almost like their children in that they were all made with loving effort and hope. There were of course emotionless craftsmen as well that only used pure skill and logic in their crafting, but you could always see it as the products lacked that special something that came from caring about what you were doing. There was a reason those craftsmen never reached the peak of the art, however, as they simply lacked the passion to go beyond what was already understood and thus never found the wonders that lay in the unknown. Nick spent the next few months working alongside Hephaestus when he wasn't busy running the city or assisting Dumbledore with something. The goddess was openly flirting with him for most of that, and even wore rather revealing clothes at points to tease him. A good example was when she wore a red bikini one of the days that covered the important parts but left everything else visible. Nick didn't get much work done that day, as he was rather distracted the whole time. There was a few things that had changed from Zeus's return, however, during this time. The first was that the god had carved out a third of the planet for his own and had started forcing the people there to do his bidding. It was rough, as quite a few were killed for defiance immediately, as subservience was not a trait many modern people had. The new Olympus Empire, they called that area of the world now, and it was avoided heavily. Zeus had also apparently tried making up for lost time and had taken several women, willing or not, as members of his harem, and news of several of their pregnancies reached Nick and Hephaestus. Chapter 596, First Shikai and Celebrimbor. Zeus was a harsh master and enslaved those within his empire to build himself a grand palace as well as an army for conquering the rest of the world. That later of those was something that everyone agreed was not allowed, however, and Nick along with Dumbledore and Flammel sent saboteurs to destroy the military supplies on regular intervals. Zeus was helpless to stop it, however, as even if he killed these people they had signed up for this job knowing that it was a possibility, so more would just take their place. Even more ironically, whenever Zeus tried to send people to assassinate all three of them, since they were in Hephaestus's territory and thus out of his personal reach, the people he sent almost immediately turned their backs on the god. Why wouldn't they, considering how he treated those under him? Without the few factors that previously restrained his cruelty, Zeus went full-blown tyrant and was hated by damn near every person in his territory. Without anyone capable of standing up to the god, however, rebellion was also impossible. It was a nightmarish situation for that third of the world's population. In a positive change, however, someone had finally released their Shikai from those who had been given blank Zanpakutos. The released weapon was a shield, interestingly enough, with the name Rotki Kagami or Dewdrop Mirror. The ability of the weapon was a mix of absorption and reflection. The way it worked was that anything that touched the mirror-like face of the shield sank in and was rejected back out without any loss of momentum. In a manner of speaking, it was the embodiment of "you can have this back." Nick himself found it funny how the first released weapon was defensive in nature but didn't have any issue with it. The owner of the weapon, however, was a surprise, as it was the poison-wielding hunter, Mary Ernest. She herself didn't have any problem with this new weapon at all, as in her words it would actually help her survive should she come across an enemy stronger than her. Thanks to her experience and the data collected from her, Nick and Hephaestus were able to adjust the creation process of the Zanpakuto to make it more compatible with Muggles. None of the wizards with Zanpakutos had gotten a Shikai yet, however, so they were still a bit stuck on that front. One had to remember that these things were created for pure spiritual beings originally, so a considerable amount of data was needed to adjust them for flesh and blood beings like wizards and Muggles. Thankfully, the creator of the style was a genius and had more or less made the things all-inclusive so long as one had a soul. There was another change that came out of seemingly nowhere that had Nick celebrating. Celebrimbor had being allowed to leave Nick's mindscape by the system because it deemed Nick beyond his influence now. The catch, however, was that the Elf Lord still had to be bound to Nick in some regard, so Nick chose the best option he had. He sent Celebrimbor's soul into the waters of his realm to be reborn as a Dremora. All Didra born from the waters were bound to the realm, which was a part of Nick, so it was technically allowed. It is unusual having flesh after this length of time, the Elf Lord said with a funny look as he flexed his muscles in the realm. Welcome back to the land of the living. It's no Middle-earth, but I imagine you'll adapt just fine. Nick said with a smile. I think I will, yes. I wonder though, am I still an elf or something else now? Celebrimbor asked curiously. You are still an elf, but rather than Maya-related you are Didric in essence. It's basically the same idea though, with the minor difference that upon death you will simply be reborn within the water here rather than pass to the afterlife. Nick said honestly. I see. Always know that should you have need of me I shall leap to your aid, of this I swear. The elf said solemnly. I appreciate the sentiment, truly I do, but it is unnecessary. I would not risk another for my problems. Nick said seriously, and Celebrimbor nodded. Perhaps so, but oaths are sacred things and it would not sit well with my mind not to give you one. Not after this gift you have given me. He said stubbornly. Nick sighed but chose to accept it as he knew better than to argue with the stubborn elf. The old elf wasted no time at all after that, asking to use the crafting room since he had been unable to do anything besides watch as Nick crafted things for this entire time. Chapter 597, Celebrimbor. It was rather funny to see how the interaction between Hephaestus and Celebrimbor went, as the goddess was highly confused by the elf lord. First and foremost, he was unlike anything she had ever seen, as unlike Nick, who was a strange fusion of many races, Celebrimbor was pure elf and old as all hell to boot. That last part really bothered her, as she had a very hard time wrapping her head around the idea that a race could be innately immortal. Celebrimbor was patient with her, however, and tried his best to explain the situation without mentioning the system. Beyond this, however, the elf lord integrated into the world quite easily, as he had witnessed it from Nick's mindscape for quite some time now. Over the next few days the elf had come to be not only accepted into the city but was even revered to a good degree after he gave the hunters some instruction in combat on a whim. One needed to remember that Celebrimbor was a highly experienced warrior who had spent decades to centuries honing his skill in combat. Thanks to this he was able to manhandle every hunter in the city, and he even taught them in the process. The most interesting battle, however, was between Sirius and Celebrimbor, as Sirius had made a point of honing himself as much as possible after the world went to pot. This meant he regularly sparred physically with the hunters and fought against beasts with both his magic and at this point strong physical body. Celebrimbor had yet to begin learning magic, but it was planned for the near future since he obviously had the ability to use it, since he was at the peak of Tier 3 at the moment. Sirius was not a simple fighter at all, as he was a trickster at heart and thus regularly threw in feints and distractions during their spar. Even Celebrimbor had to admit that he needed to take it a bit seriously in order to not lose from the unfamiliar strings of spells and attacks Sirius sent his way. The Black Patriarch lost, of course, but he gave Celebrimbor a run for his money, which was plenty to earn the elf lord's respect. When it came to crafting, however, Celebrimbor was like a sponge, as he not only shook off the rust from his long time inactivity but also learned and mastered everything Nick had learned and added to his style over the years. The old elf, however, wanted nothing to do with the Nemaya style, as he felt it was a sort of crutch for magical beings rather than a boon. Not to say he couldn't appreciate the concepts that went into the style, but anything that a Zanpakuto could accomplish could be done with magic already if one were to put in the effort. For Muggles it was a way forward, which he was fine with, but for magical beings it was little more than a crutch that would be more damaging than helpful unless you were a talentless or lazy individual. The Twilight style, however, was Celebrimbor's new favorite, though as an elf he was innately close to that domain and thus rapidly learned and mastered the style under Nick's help. He even hoped to mix it in his own style to create even more powerful objects. Neither Hephaestus or Nick tried to dissuade him, as while they had thought of doing so themselves, it was too much effort compared to the possible payout. The elf knew this, of course, but the fact that his style had a hard limit of Tier 5 bothered him, so he was willing to pay whatever it took to raise that limit. Mixing the two styles would indeed accomplish this, but only to the peak of tier 5 at most, as the benefits the light material could bring to the table for the style were additive rather than multiplicative. To put it bluntly, this was a long and difficult path that the Elf Lord had chosen, but one that at its conclusion would possibly set him at the level of a god. Nick took great joy when it came to teaching Celebrimbor magic over the next few months, as the Elf Lord had to start from the very basics. The wand that chose the Elf Lord was also an interesting one in that it was a 10-inch elderwood wand, with the core being one of Nazgul's shed feathers. Despite this, however, Celebrimbor came to loathe Nick's lessons on magic, as he took great joy in pointing out the mistakes the Elf Lord had made in a harsh manner. Nick was an absolute demon when it came to learning, as he accepted nothing less than perfection in the basics before allowing Celebrimbor to move on to the more advanced subjects. Chapter 598, Passing Time and Discoveries. Nick wasn't just teaching the stuff that Hogwarts did though, but the basics of magic as he knew it, so it was far more in-depth and comprehensive. This meant that despite learning extremely fast, Celebrimbor was still technically in the first year of Hogwarts in terms of magical skill. Had he learned just the stuff that the school taught, he would likely already be approaching the 5th year mark, but Nick was making sure the fundamentals were set before allowing him to move on. There were pros and cons to this style of teaching, but the Elf Lord only complained a little, since he knew that in the long run this would pan out. Besides this, not much had happened in the world, as Zeus was marshalling forces with heavy opposition while he tried to grow his own power. The rest of the world was also starting to stabilize as people and magical beasts reached a treacherous balance. The Americas that Hestia had taken over had been condensed into a series of large cities that survived but were rather crowded in most people's opinions. The goddess herself had basically just made it clear that if someone didn't like the way things were, they were free to leave. A few wizards or brave muggles did, but nobody knew if they made it or not, as no one had heard from them after that. Nick and Hestia did not get along, however, as the moment they met both felt repulsed by the other instinctively. It wasn't hard to figure out why either, as by his nature Nick was a chaotic force and Hestia's domains were all about order. Personality-wise they were fine if a bit clashing in opinion, but both had a tacit understanding to stay away from the other. Clashing natures was no laughing matter, as it meant they both felt violently aggressive towards the other for no other reason beyond merely existing. Hephaestus accepted that coexistence was possible, but being friendly was off the table entirely. Nick himself had been cranking out a great deal of rings while he waited for his progress through Tier 5 to Tier 6 finish so he could stockpile points again. On average his rings netted him between 100 and 1,000 points each, so he was making good progress, as he had already stored up 500,000 points again, despite him also hemorrhaging points in his constant purchasing of new knowledge from the system, as well as refilling his stores of Soul Reaper energy. As it turned out, the energy itself wasn't that expensive so much as the jewels it came in. The hollow energy Nick had covered by separating some from himself to store, since he made it passively now. One would think that it took a great deal of these two types of energy to create a single Asachi, but that was wrong. It actually took a very small amount, but the trick was that the two types of energy needed to be fused and shaped extremely carefully, or the final result would fail. Interestingly enough, Nick discovered something amazing about the style that even its creator hadn't known. The starting shape of the Zanpakuto before it was imprinted actually created a different result based on what it was. The creator of the style had only ever made blank Zanpakuto that were in weapon shape, so most of the time the imprinted ones were also suited for combat to some degree. However, by creating ring-shaped blank Zanpakuto, Nick discovered that not only were the shikai for them not combat-related, but they could even allow one to craft via their Zanpakuto alone. These types of shikai were thus labeled support types, as they weren't meant for combat but rather to lend aid to those who went into it instead. Healing, crafting, creative and buffing Zanpakuto were all very common in those who got their shikai from ring blanks. The creative types that could produce resources like metal or plants were classified as treasures in the city, as in exchange for some effort by the wielders people could get supplies, so the price of those things went down drastically. A good example would be a shikai owned by a potion maker that could create and control slime. This slime allowed the person wielding the Zanpakuto to absorb an organic ingredient and add that ingredient's property to the slime without any change in how a potion made with the original ingredient would function. The best part was that the guy could swap the properties at will after he absorbed a sample, so he was a walking potion ingredient gold mine. Snape had sent no less than 100 messages trying to get the guy with that Zanpakuto to work for him. Chapter 599, Zanpakuto Revolution. Not that he could be blamed, considering that besides adjusting the recipes slightly to accommodate the slime instead of the normal ingredients, the end result was the same as normal. For a Pokemon like Snape, this ability was the stuff of wet dreams, as it meant damn near endless ingredients for no price at all, really. The guy with the ability knew better than to leave Nick's city though, as it was the front runner of pioneering and advancement in the world, so leaving would be downright stupid. Hell, these Zanpakuto that Nick had introduced had revolutionized the whole city almost overnight. Once more and more people with shikais started popping up. Food? Plant growth Zanpakuto. Water? Rain, river, ice, or even cloud creating Zanpakutos. Everything a growing country could possibly need was available for cheap thanks to the inclusion of Zanpakutos. The best part was that thanks to these things that worked for Muggles without any issue, the gaps between the two sides were starting to close as the Muggles were slowly getting over their jealousy of not having magic themselves. It wasn't all good times though, as like in all cases when someone is given more power than they know what to do with, it went to a few of their heads. These people turned arrogant and rude while thinking they were the center of the world just because their Zanpakuto was considered powerful or very valuable. A good example of this was a Muggle who got a powerful lightning-based weapon Zanpakuto and started bullying others since theirs were weaker than his own. Nick himself appeared for this matter and with a wave of his hand tore out the soul of weapon, leaving it as nothing more than a piece of dead metal. As if that wasn't already bad enough, the weapon soul itself thanked Nick for doing it, as it had become disgusted by how the Muggle changed after getting a taste of power. Nick then placed the manifested soul in a special state that allowed it to exist without relying on the Muggle's spiritual energy. It was unable to grow without a wielder, but it could still live out its days as is just fine. After that, the Muggle got a taste of karma as his previous victims came to mock the now powerless man in revenge that everyone turned a blind eye to. The weapon soul that had the name Hikari no Hana or Light Blossom was a kind individual that worked as a server at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor in Midtown. The Muggle had cried, begged, threatened, and attempted to trick the weapon soul into returning to him, but it all failed and he was chased off instead. With such a clear example set in place, few else fell prey to the temptation of pride and cruelty. There were others of course, but they too were punished harshly, with the worst even being killed by their weapon spirit after it had been freed, despite this meaning almost certain destruction for it. Unfortunately, Zanpakuto spirits were tied to their owners, so upon death the Zanpakuto will begin to decay and die just as its owner did. This process can be slowed through various methods but never stopped. Nobody knew how exactly, but after that spirit killed its owner, Nick took it away, and when it returned it was no longer a Zanpakuto spirit but a true flesh and blood living being. Nick and those close to him knew what had happened, however, as he had chosen to give that spirit the option of being reborn as a Daedra bound to the realm forevermore. This was always an option even with ghosts like Helena, but Nick had never offered it to them lightly, as it meant they would never truly be free. Being tied to his realm meant they could not escape him and were subject to his will at any given moment for eternity. In many ways it could be considered a fate worse than death or being a ghost like Helena. It was for this reason that she had not accepted it even when he offered it to her. Nick considered this to be a last resort type thing, such as the case with the Zanpakuto spirit or Celebrimbor, where it was quite literally their only option for living. An interesting thing Nick discovered, however, was that becoming a Daedra did not strip the Zanpakuto spirit of its own abilities but rather seemed to turn them into bloodline abilities for it. This was quite fascinating as far as Nick was concerned, as the abilities weren't a part of their body originally but from their souls, so the change from metaphysical to physical was very big. Chapter 600, Supply and Demand. While Nick himself was beyond bloodline abilities as a Tier 5 going on 7, that didn't mean that it was any less of an important discovery. From what he could understand, most bloodline abilities were, for a lack of better explanation, paths to follow towards divinity. The reason for this was that if one were to focus their progress around their abilities, then the domains tied to those same abilities were grasped much faster than those who lacked this direction to grow in. In simple terms, bloodline abilities made it easier to reach divinity. While it was true that bloodline abilities also granted more immediate benefits to those who have them, it was also very true that these benefits tended to stop being all that relevant once one hit Tier 4, as any wizard or witch that got that far on the path had spells just as powerful. Even Nick's own bloodline abilities were just powerful applications of magic at this point, with the exception of his avian dominion and all understanding ones. Those were always useful as they had nothing to do with power to begin with. Anyway, this discovery of Zanpakuto spirit turned Daedra bloodline ability conversion had Nick curious to see if he could mimic this process to a degree in order to artificially introduce new bloodline abilities in already born wizards. The reason he hadn't even considered doing so for Muggles was that thanks to the knowledge he got from his newest crafting style, turning a mundane soul into anything not was a slow and in most cases not worthwhile process. Previously, when he tried to forcefully add magic to a non-magical soul, the creature died since they spawned magic in their bodies but had no way of releasing it. As it turned out, according to the information he got with his new style, such brute force methods would in almost every single case result in death. So Nick wasn't willing to gamble on success in hopes of converting the Muggles to magicals using that method. That said, he also had high hopes that the introduction of Zanpakuto amongst the Muggles would cause them to evolve in a sort of spiritual human race not unlike the Quincy. This way, even if the population of wizards on the planet didn't dramatically rise, the Muggles would not be so helpless to keep up with them. As for why Nick didn't think the Zanpakuto would give the wizards an unfair advantage in the case they were also influenced by their usage? Because wizards already empowered their own souls simply by learning and using magic. Adding Zanpakuto to that doesn't do anything besides speeding the growth up a bit. Even if the average power of wizards in the world rises to tier 3 rather than tier 1 or 2, it won't change the fact that only the really dedicated or talented could set foot in tier 4 and beyond. For this reason Nick began to set aside some of the blank Zanpakuto to be sold to other parts of the world. Dumbledore and Flamel were the first to get access to them outside Nick's territory, and even then it was in small quantities as they still had to deal with war bands and thieves. Thievery in Nick's city was impossible as each and every Zanpakuto was documented alongside who got it. The entries and exits to the city was also monitored strictly, so you couldn't just nab an item and leave. You couldn't fly or dig your way out either, as both those routes were under constant monitor, so any unauthorized intrusion into them below or above a certain point was spotted immediately. Good luck finding anyone to buy said stolen goods in the city, as well as without the ridiculous laws banning so many things that the ministry had a lot of previously illegal goods could now be sold openly. This meant that there wasn't really any need for a black market or criminal underworld in the city. Nick had taken the most useful parts of laws and rules from history and, after modifying them based on logic, applied them to his city. As a result, crime was damn near non-existent in his city, as there simply wasn't any need for it. It wasn't a utopia or any such impossible concept, but it was better than everywhere else, and that was all that mattered. In a funny twist, Zeus actually sent people demanding Zanpakuto for his own empire for equality, which had Nick and Hephaestus laughing their heads off. It was such a load of crap that even the people across the ocean could smell it. Obviously Zeus recognized the war potential of the Zanpakuto and wanted to possess it for his own, or perhaps he was worried that Hephaestus would grow an army so powerful using them that his own would get stomped easily. Comment. 7. Comment. Vote. Chapter 601, Advances. He couldn't be blamed at all, as he had definitely noticed how much more advanced Nick's territory was compared to the rest of the world. How many foreign powers who saw how things were going for the English Isles started imitating Nick with some of their own people to great effect. For example, there was now at least 12 different organizations like the Adventurers Guild that Nick started that operated nearly the same way. That didn't sound like a lot, but keep in mind that most places around the globe have congregated into singular large entities instead of a bunch of small ones. Rather than dozens of small powers on each continent, the vast majority of people everywhere all grouped up in super cities for safety, whether they liked it or not. Death was a rather good motivator to unite for people after all. And that was what the rest of the land that had been taken back by the beasts and plant life was: death. Everything was now much more powerful or dangerous for other reasons, like magical toxins and diseases, and even the plants that were once known to be safe for consumption were now questionable at best or inedible now. Potatoes, for example, had become dangerous to eat, as 1 in 10 plants mutated to have magical toxins within the whole plant. Tomatoes, on the other hand, were downright lethal to consume now, which was a great loss to culinary arts as a whole. The inverse was also true, however, in that many things that had been inedible were now safe to eat. An example was the manchineel tree that went from horribly deadly to literal candy creation. The sap and fruits that were very harmful previously had done a full 360 after the mana surge and were now perfectly safe and super sweet like the purest honey. Anyway, Nick skipped the awkward experimental stage with determining what was and was not safe to eat and directly created a magical plant that used the ambient mana as fuel to rapidly produce highly nutritious fruit. The plant itself was a tree with blue bark, and the fruit it produced was the size of a coconut and was bright green with a thin rind around the bland but filling flesh. The tree produced about 500 fruits a day, and Nick had 10 of them at the moment. The only reason he was even able to make the things, however, was that he exerted his power as a Daedric lord and forcefully spawned the plants from his realm before transplanting them into the real world. 5,000 fruits a day wasn't nearly enough to feed the nearly 20 million people in Nick's territory, but thankfully most animals had grown much larger in size, so hunting and the remaining edible plants being grown on the farms in the territory kept their heads above water with a limit to 2 meals a day. It wasn't ideal by any means, but it was enough to survive and even thrive, as Nick was always working on creating more fruit trees. The Zanpakuto really helped with the food, as there was a few that had abilities to accelerate or enlarge plant growth. The most powerful of which was a weapon Zanpakuto, however, that turned the surrounding plant life into the wielder's absolute control. This meant that they could revert the previously edible plants back to that state, which was a very valuable ability. Nick and the governing body of the territory all made sure that person was paid well for their services. This didn't mean that the person wasn't sent off to places that needed help with their food issues, such as to Dumbledore and Flamel. It was rather funny how many people tried to poach the person from Nick while they were helping abroad but got harshly shot down with reality. The fact was that even getting a king's treatment was a fool's bargain if it meant leaving Nick's territory. Even an idiot could see that the place wasn't just going to stagnate and let everywhere else catch up but was going to continue advancing further and further ahead of the rest. Even more so, Hephaestus's status as a goddess was no longer a secret after Hestia and Zeus made it clear that the gods had returned. There was simply no reason why Nick or Hephaestus should keep it hidden at this point, so she had been seen and felt within his territory. Despite this, though, it was obvious that the goddess was close to Nick, as she rarely left the island for any reason besides to observe the Zanpakuto in action. With two powerhouses like that backing the territory and the great advancements it made, it would be stupid to leave such a place. Chapter 602, Assassin and Inhumanity. It was early November, on the 5th to be exact, when the day-to-day activity in Nick's territory got shook up. Nick was out at the Adventurers Guild with Hephaestus gathering data from Zanpakuto users that had achieved Shikai to see how they could tweak the creation of Zanpakuto to better serve their users. During this process, a frail-looking old man entered the guild and looked to be heading to the counter, which was past Nick when Nick's danger senses went off. Pucci. A golden spear tip pierced through his chest, missing his heart thanks to him moving out of the way just in time. But a fatal wound nonetheless, as poison surged from the wound as Zeus, who had been in disguise, fled the area. The flesh rotted rapidly in that location, but Nick remained calm, if rather irritated. I hadn't expected to lose this body like this at all. Ugh, so much work to explain why I am not dead after this, he thought as the body started to die. Relinquishing control over the body, Nick briefly floated everywhere in his realm before his full conscious entered his second body. The air shimmered, and in an instant Nick stood next to his own corpse in the guild hall. Nick, is that you? Sirius asked with a confused look at Nick, who was clearly not human. It is. This is just another body of mine. I admit that I had not anticipated Zeus assassinating my original body in such a manner. I apologize for this sudden reveal, but as you can tell, I was not left with much choice. Nick said calmly, while everyone nearby surprisingly didn't look uncomfortable with his current form but rather relieved that he wasn't dead. You all seem unbothered by my form, why? He asked after seeing this, as it confused him. No offense, Nick, but people were actually betting on whether or not you were even human for a while now. Don't get me wrong, your form, as you call it, is rather off-putting but not really hard to accept. Sirius said with a shrug. Nick was surprised by this answer, as he had thought his secret of not being human was fairly well kept. What made people question my race anyways? Nick asked curiously. It was a bunch of stuff really, your eyes, the weird affinity for crafting you have, your power, age and skill, a bunch of stuff, but the really big one was that God's awful presence of yours. It honestly feels like you are 2 seconds away from killing and eating everyone here at any given moment. No offense. Sirius said honestly. Thinking back on it, Nick found it rather foolish of him to not have considered the sort of presence and aura he would have as whatever he was now. Elves were otherworldly feeling, celestial birds were beastly proud creatures of power, Daedra were primal beings of chaos and power, and hollows were not much different, except rather than power they were all about hunger instead. All that considered, and it was pretty clear that his presence would probably make people nervous even if he wasn't tier 5. I am sorry if I have made any of you uncomfortable, it was not my intention. Nick said honestly, and most of the people here just waved it off. It wasn't easy to bother them, since as adventurers they regularly encountered strange or crazy things out in the wild. Still, I think we all want to know what with the dead body on the floor and all that, but were you ever human? One of the adventurers asked curiously. I suppose I have no need to hide it anymore, but yes, I was a few years ago. I first started my change away from humanity in my first year at Hogwarts, in fact. What I am now is actually a fairly recent change, at only a year and a half roughly since I became like this. Nick explained honestly. How's this body here work then? Are you some sort of hive mind or something? A Muggle hunter asked worriedly as he pointed at the corpse on the floor. Nick chuckled. Not at all, both this body and that one are truly mine and never belonged to anyone else. It's hard to explain, but I can assure you that I am only one mind rather than a network of minds like you are worried about. Speaking of, I really should take that so I can recycle it and put it back to use. This form isn't exactly inconspicuous, as you can clearly tell. Nick said as he waved his hand, sending his dead body into the realm to get recycled. Chapter 603, Revenge. Nick didn't even bring his current body back into the realm as he started breaking down his original body into its base components. Normally he would just be able to repair the damage and then kickstart the heart again to return life to the body, but thanks to Zeus's poison that was impossible, as all the blood and flesh of the body had been necrotized. You can't heal dead cells, so the entire body had to be scrapped to remove the poison before he had to rebuild the entire thing. It wasn't hard, as Nick knew every single detail of his original body on a cellular level and just had to put the base components together in the correct order. For a Daedric realm lord familiar with the body being made, this was little more than child's play. Within 15 minutes Nick had a new body that was almost the exact same as his previous one. The biggest difference was that this body, while human or elvish in appearance, was still very much Daedric. Still, once Nick took control of it and swapped it with his Daedric form in the real world, no one could tell the difference from before, so it did its job. Done this sort of thing before I take it? Sirius asked while checking out the new body. Only once before, when creating the form I was just using. It's actually quite easy once you figure out the basics. Nick said casually. It was at this point in time that Hephaestus returned from her chase after Zeus with a frustrated expression. Nick wasn't surprised that she hadn't caught him, as it was clear that Zeus's lightning domain focused on speed and power primarily, and lightning was one of the fastest things on Earth. As a result, it made it very difficult for one to try and catch Zeus without a similarly fast domain. One would think that teleporting and speed were hand in hand, but in fact that wasn't actually true, as space was all about stability and stagnation. This meant that when teleporting or manipulating space at all, there is always a noticeable delay when it was used. During that delay, a truly fast enemy like Zeus would spot and evade the teleportation, which made the whole point of it moot unless you knew where they were heading. You need not fret over your lack of success catching him. Since he has made the first move, it is only fair I return the favor. No, Nick said with a smirk which cheered her up. What do you have in mind? She asked curiously. Nick's revenge was simple and at the same time effective to behold. Zeus destroyed one of his bodies, so Nick thought it only fair he take something the god held dear. Simply put, Nick was going to steal the Master Bolt from Zeus. That was the weapon that Zeus had wielded to pierce through his body and had possessed for a great deal of his life. To say that Zeus was attached to the weapon would be a grave understatement, as the weapon was so tightly connected to the god that Nick was certain it was actually a part of his domains at this point. Depriving Zeus of this weapon would be a massive blow to his power and may even make his foundation unstable from having one of its pillars ripped away. The few spies who hadn't been noticed yet had revealed all of Zeus's habits, and the god was sloppy and careless in his own empire. Clearly he didn't think anyone would have the guts to attack him in his territory, and as a result tended to leave his weapon unprotected when he entertained his harem. Nick chose to seal away all his power and sneak into the palace of the god while he was busy, and snatched the weapon into his realm before vanishing from the palace in the instant the god had been alarmed. The weapon resisted and rampaged in the realm to try and heed its master's call, but Nick had the realm slowly weaken and break it down to be absorbed. So I was right. The weapon did hold a part of his domain. Nick thought with a grin as the mana in his realm surged to hyper-dense levels as the power of the weapon was assimilated into it. Even better, Nick was able to for a few days at least gain insight into the lightning domain that had been attached to the weapon, which was an unexpected but welcome profit. Zeus himself, however, was not doing so hot, as a part of his power's foundation had been forcefully ripped from him and destroyed, which set his power back to the point he was now fearful of Hephaestus coming to kill him, as he was weaker than before while she was even more powerful. Chapter 604, Displeasure and Time Skip. Zeus POV. As much as I hate to admit it, I was wrong. In my hubris I had thought that the man that my daughter had attached herself to was merely just a talented mortal. I have watched my daughter for millennium, so I know better than any that she lacked the ability to create these strange crafting methods that her territory is filled with items from. These Zanpakuto in particular are of great concern, as with them every mortal in her territory is now more dangerous than most trained mortals in my army. I had believed that the man my daughter attached herself to was merely a grand talent in crafting and had greatly improved her power with his own knowledge. I believed that if I were to kill this mortal she would stop growing. I was wrong. Oh, was I wrong? The man had fooled the entire world into believing the body he appeared as to be his true form, and even I was fooled into thinking I had succeeded in killing him with a sneak attack. As it turned out, however, the bastard had been barely inconvenienced by my actions. It was shameful for me and I hated him for it. I had thought to indulge myself in my harem to ease my frustration, but I could never have expected what happened next. My precious companion, the Master Bolt, had been stolen from me and destroyed, taking a large chunk of my power with it. For the first time since I fought my father and the other titans, I felt true fear. Not the petty concerns of being deposed or defied, but the understanding that I was in serious danger. I was forced into hiding as my daughter came to hunt me down like a wounded deer. It was humiliating, and I wanted nothing more than to teach her where she belonged, under my foot. But I had to bide my time until I recovered and grew more powerful, so I sent her one last glare before vanishing in the sea of mortals. I found a spot outside of her perception to live in the meanwhile, a cave below the frozen landscape of the southern part of the world. There I hid and focused all my time and energy on repairing the damage the destruction of my weapon had caused. 2 years later, normal POV. 2 years had come and gone since Nick destroyed the Master Bolt and Hephaestus scared Zeus into hiding like a coward. The world had changed greatly in this time, as Zanpakutos had made their way into every nation and profession. Civilization had more or less reached the same point as it had before the mana surge in terms of stability. At the forefront of this recovery and advancement was Nick and Hephaestus. Together they had made many powerful items that raised the quality of life for the people in their territories so high that it was hard for other nations to keep their people from trying to go there. Sports had been revived in that place, the city was a massive magical marvel as the entire thing had been enchanted, personal achievement had never been higher and there were 2 gods residing there. Yes, Nick had reached tier 7 in the last 2 years, though there was a problem neither he or Hephaestus had anticipated. While he was technically tier 7, his power was only tier 6 as he simply lacked the mana to fully exert his tier 7 power. This was no small sum to make up either. While the realm had grown many times larger and now had a surface area similar to a medium-sized state from pre-ritual America, his mana was nowhere near the same as a standard tier 7. Despite this, however, he was a bona fide god now, and that came with quite a few perks. First and most important in his opinion was that his mind now worked at unbelievably fast speeds that exceeded even Hephaestus's. This was to be expected considering what his domains were, however, so neither of them cared all that much. The second perk was that Nick could quite literally see the domains that made up the world as his mana senses had evolved after reaching tier 7. According to Hephaestus, the gods who held the magic domain usually had something similar, so it too was par for the course. The third perk, however, was an entirely unique thing for Nick as he had become a Daedric Prince, a weak one granted but one nonetheless. He was officially the Daedric Prince of creation, destruction, and hunger. This wasn't mere titles, however, as they held real power and gave Nick access to those domains. In truth, the first 2 were from all of his original domains fusing together upon reaching godhood, and the last from his hollow part. Chapter 605, Higher Domains. At first glance one would think that all domains were equal, but like all things in the world that simply isn't true. Some domains are simply more important on a reality scale, such as space and time. Many domains relied on these 2 in order to even exist after all. Creation and destruction were 2 domains that actually consisted of multiple other domains in a sort of overarching umbrella domain. Magic, souls, fire, weather and lightning were all domains that fell under destruction, which barely qualified Nick to attain it upon his apotheosis. In the same vein, magic, souls, crafting, language and weather were domains that fell under creation, which made Nick more in tune with this domain than the other. Nick's bird and hunger domains were the only 2 that simply didn't fit in his general domain scheme. One would think the hunger domain to fall under the destruction domain, but it was actually under the nature domain alongside the bird domain. Despite this, Nick's attainments in these 2 domains was shallow at best, as he had never bothered to spend any time on them, so he was unqualified to receive the nature domain as well. This transformation to a higher domain was actually an innate trait that all beings that weren't born gods have upon reaching divinity if they have multiple domains under a greater domain. The reason for this was because of the world itself balancing things out. Born gods were tier 7 right away, and as a result had no time at all to really build up mastery of their domains before ascending. Apotheosis was not a simple process, and upon achieving it all of one's mastery was judged, for lack of a better word, and rewarded by the world accordingly. Without any mastery of their domains, since they were born gods, they got no rewards, as in many ways simply being born a god was reward enough. Having higher domains didn't automatically mean that someone was more powerful than other gods, however. That simply wasn't how domains worked, but rather it was about potential instead. Regular domains only had so many possible ways to be mastered before they simply ran out of potential. A good example was the crafting domain that Nick and Hephaestus had. Even though the styles Nick introduced had major differences, they also had many similarities. This applied to every crafting style he might get in the future as well, which meant that at some point that domain simply won't grow anymore regardless of the effort put into it. Fire and lightning were the same in how limited they were. Higher domains like creation and destruction, on the other hand, were far broader in terms of potential because they held the regular domains that fell under them, which was quite a long list. In other words, Nick wasn't more powerful than Hephaestus and Zeus, but he had more room for growth and power in the future. This was very bad news for Zeus, as it meant that he was now limited in time, as if he didn't manage to kill Nick before he can grow into this potential, it was game over for him. The problem came in the form of Nick being damn near impossible to kill thanks to being bound to his realm. Speaking of the realm, Nick no longer needed to keep the ring that housed it on his person to freely access it. This meant he had been able to hide away the only weakness he had far from Zeus's perception. Unless Nick was stupid and brought the god into the realm, he was effectively immortal in the truest sense of the word. Zeus didn't know this though, and while he repaired and honed his power over the last 2 years, everyone else in the world wasn't idle either. No new gods besides Nick had appeared, but a few new tier 4s and 5s had shown up. There was even a couple tier 6s in the form of the Flammels that had become prominent. On the list of tier 4s was unsurprisingly Snape, who was only lacking in pure mana to reach that point previously. What was an unexpected addition to that list was Hagrid, whose giant blood had made him grow in pure power after the ritual had finished, and over this past 2 years had broken into Tier 4 just based on his own knowledge and mastery of nature. Dumbledore had become Tier 5 as well, but that was honestly to be expected. The biggest improvement, however, was Celebrimbor, who had endured Nick's tough teaching and made great strides over the last 2 years. He had grown to Tier 4 but had fallen in love with the subtleties of magic and thus tended to obsess over the things he didn't know about it rather than work on advancing his power. Chapter 606, Improvements in Nin. During the last 2 years Nick had spent millions of points on new knowledge from the system and grown his library into a madness-inducingly large and complex thing. Of course there was also a Dwemer lexicon version of the library, as well as he had finished digesting the lexicon he got years back. He now knew basically everything the Dwemer had thought to include within it. Amongst that knowledge was information on alchemically altering plant life as well as various new farming informations from that world. Thanks to this, the food problem had been truly and completely solved in Nick's territory. Not to say he hadn't helped others with it either, but unlike his territory that could speed up the results via Zanpakutos that were commonplace, the others would need at least another year to begin to see results. Nick had also chosen to purchase one of the power systems from another world to supplement his people's lack of power. To be more specific, he purchased the knowledge on it and spent a while to bring it into reality in this world. The reason for this was because Nick had noticed a rather glaring flaw with the Zanpakuto's improvement of power in those wielding them. Time. It simply took too long for those wielding the things in safety to gain more power. This was the nature of the spiritual energy that the Zanpakuto affected, as fast growth only came from danger. After achieving Shikai there was a spike in power held by the person wielding the weapons, but after that it was agonizingly slow. To fix this, Nick chose a power system that didn't clash with magic or Zanpakutos and still offered a fairly quick improvement. Nin. Not to be confused with the Elvish word for water, this system of power was basically the manipulation of one's own life force to create effects that were very similar to magic. Unlike magic, however, the rules for this system of power were downright crooked and seemingly made little to no sense. Basically, one using it first released their life force from their body in the form of aura, which is just raw energy at that point. After that comes harnessing the energy and controlling it. After that, one needs to determine what type of Nin they are compatible with, of which there are 6 types. Enhancement, that focuses on empowering one's physical body and all the aspects involved in that. Transmutation, that transforms one's energy to an element or property. Emission allows the user to detach their aura from their bodies, allowing for ranged energy attacks and abilities. Conjuration is all about creating objects out one's aura. Manipulation is about controlling others and objects using one's aura. Finally is the rarest form of Nin, specialization, that has properties from all the others equally and can bypass their boundaries as a result. The way the type of Nin is figured out for each person is through a method known as water divination. The way water divination works is that a glass of water with a leaf floating on top of it is filled with one's aura, and the innate properties of the energy that person possesses changes something in the water or leaf. For enhancers, the water will increase from seemingly thin air. For transmuters, the taste of the water will change. For emitters, the water will change color. For conjurers, the water forms impurities in it like salt or metal or even dirt. For manipulators, the leaf floating at the top of the water will move without any outside force acting on it. Specialists, however, are categorized as such when something beyond each of the other identifiers happens to the water, which can vary from specialist to specialist. Regardless of which type of Nin one has, they can create abilities that use properties from other types but should typically stick to the type they are naturally inclined towards. The abilities one creates are in theory only limited by type, imagination, and restrictions. Basically, one figures out what they want the ability to do and then from there begin placing restrictions on it to determine its rough power, with the more limitations or the harsher they are, the more powerful the ability. For example, if you were an enhancer, you could create an ability that lets you increase your strength, stamina, and durability. But in exchange you have to be performing a specific movement to activate it, or you can only use it for a certain amount of time, or even really harsh stuff like taking time off your lifespan per use. Regardless, the final result is determined by one's imagination and the limits they place on themselves. There is a universal limit for all Nin users, however, that applies when they explain their ability, as this is a purposeful handicap and as such empowers them temporarily. Chapter 607, Nin Abilities. Nick and Hephaestus were the first to officially gain Nin abilities, with Nick unlocking it by his own effort and Hephaestus getting it unlocked by Nick. As a god with a massive life force, Nick accidentally knocked out everyone in the territory the moment he unlocked his, as it was uncontrolled and fully extended. He wasn't using it on anyone though, so it merely brushed against them and sent them to sleep. It was a bit annoying, but Nick needed to go to the realm in order to fully grasp and control his body's aura. He was certain that it was supposed to be harder to master than that, but he managed it in less than a day thanks to being able to calculate and quantify the energy using his Daedric powers. Nick found it rather funny how it was so easy for him to master because he as a Daedra was innately sensitive to life force. Typically not a good thing, but in this case it worked out perfectly as it helped him unlock and master the energy in a short period of time. Hephaestus took much longer at about a week of non-stop meditation. After that they tested their Nin affinities and Hephaestus got transmutation. Nick on the other hand got mixed results. His human body was a natural emitter, but his Daedric body was a specialist as the water turned into steam under its aura. His true form couldn't even use Nin to begin with since he didn't have a physical form technically, no Daedra did. The bodies they were seen as were merely containers to house their minds in most cases. Still, the difference in Nin types between his bodies was quite interesting to Nick as it proved that the mind and soul truly had nothing to do with the power. That confirmation aside, it also presented a unique opportunity to him that he was rather interested to put into practice. For his human body, Nick created a single ability with a restriction that it was the only one he could have. He set a few conditions for the ability as well that made it entirely unusable with a single exception, his body's death. What the ability did was quite simple really, it was a pure retaliation type ability. Upon his death all of his aura and mana in his body would condense into a single spot no bigger than a grain of sand and shoot into the body of the one that killed him before detonating. This was a particularly vicious ability because it would only stop working after detonating within the body of whoever or whatever killed his body. This meant that escape was impossible regardless of speed or obstructions. Nick made this ability with Zeus in mind as he was sure the other god was nearing the point where he would come to attack again. Hephaestus hadn't stagnated over the last 2 years but had slowed to a snail's pace on her improvements. For Nick's Daedric body, however, he crafted a much different ability that was quite useful to him. Faithful Tithe was the ability he created, and the way it worked was that it allowed him to create a believer's mark, which was a small golden coin with an image of a hawk. The trick was that when the coin was held by someone who believed in him, he gained a single counter. There was no limit to how many marks he could make either. Activating his ability allowed Nick to spend these counters in order to gain a one-time tithe of mana which dissolved the marks. As far as restrictions went, Nick could only activate his tithe once a month and only on the first. He also made it so his aura was reduced to a single % as well for the rest of the month should he activate the ability. He could have made all sorts of other abilities, but this one was what he chose for the moment as his lacking mana levels were severely holding him back. Hephaestus played around with her aura but ended up settling for turning her aura into metal like mercury and called it done. Nick couldn't blame her for her lack of interest in the power, as it simply didn't scale up to divine levels without so many restrictions that it may as well not be used at all. Even Nick's human body's ability had its death as a prerequisite just to be able to reach that level in theory. That's right, theory, because until it actually goes off no one knew exactly how powerful it was going to be, only that it will be very powerful. Nick didn't expect it to kill Zeus or anything like that, but he was sure it would ruin the god's day. Chapter 608, Strange New World. Nick slowly began to unlock Nin in his citizens but came across a slight snag that he needed to overcome. Nin relied on one's body quite heavily, and as a result a prerequisite for unlocking it safely was to have a strong body, or at least an athletic one. Obviously that was kind of a problem, as besides the adventurers and hunters that regularly trained, most people were fairly lazy in terms of exercise. Nick was helpless about this as he couldn't exactly force people to regularly exercise. Well, he could, but it would just breed resentment. This unfortunately meant he had to be extra careful when unlocking people's Nin and stopped the moment it looked like their bodies were rejecting the energy. This made the distribution of Nin rather slow, as none of those who got it unlocked could use it to unlock someone else's safely themselves. Training these new Nin users in how to control the energy also took time, and few of them managed to stop hemorrhaging aura when they slept in 2 months. This wasn't to say that there weren't exceptions to this. There were 3 people who were very talented in the energy. These 3 were members of the Adventurers Guild and regularly spent considerable amounts of time exploring the wilderness and fighting magical beasts. Amongst them, the slowest to grasp their Nin only took 2 weeks, and even then only because Nick insisted on collecting data that interfered with the learning process. Nin was a new path to power for Nick, and the system had very little on the topic that wasn't mere stories or historical records of what the energy had achieved. Apparently the people of the world it came from never actually delved all that deeply in the how and why of the energy so much as the what. Specifically, what can they use it for and what are its limits? It was frustrating to say the least, as it meant that Nick had no principles beyond the ones he already knew to understand the stuff better. Bothered by this, he spent quite a lot of time performing experiments and gathering data to make hypotheses on the inner working of the energy. In the rest of the world, while this was going on, one would be hard-pressed to find more than a small remnant of the way the world used to be before the ritual. Most technology had been broken down into raw materials again, including cars, power lines, power plants, high-end equipment and much more. In quite a few ways it could be considered a whole new world, as many had come to appreciate the lack of technology once they got over their discomfort. The lack of light pollution meant that the vast array of stars overhead were visible every night, which still left many in awe even so long after the ritual had been completed. The integration of Muggle and wizarding cultures was also a widespread trend in the world, and with the addition of Zanpakuto and the other things that were getting traded out of the British Isles, civilization was unrecognizable at this point. Speaking of the Zanpakutos, there had been a rather funny set of demands from the Japanese megacity. The fact that all the names of the Zanpakuto were in Japanese had convinced that nation that Nick had stolen the creation method of the Zanpakuto from one of their members. As a result, they demanded that he return it immediately and stop producing Zanpakuto without delay. Nick had given them a big slap in the face, however, when he showed up in front of their leaders and spoke in over 20 different languages fluently and asked if that meant he had stolen the rest of his methods from somewhere else in the world. After leaving, he sent the news all over the world, which forced the Japanese to rescind their demands in humiliation as the rest of the world mocked them. This might not have been the best move politically speaking, as he definitely angered the Japanese by so openly crushing their accusations, but frankly speaking he didn't care. Why would he when he was a literal god and his final ambition would set him as the owner of the entire world itself? Forget Japan, he wouldn't care about offending much more powerful places like France and Egypt that had tier 5s and 6s backing them. At this exact moment there were only 3 beings on the entire planet who he was hesitant to offend needlessly: Hephaestus, Hestia, and Hades. Zeus would have been on that list if he wasn't going to be an enemy either way Nick acted. Chapter 609, Strange New World, 2. This wasn't to say that Nick went out of his way to offend every other country in the world, but he wasn't going to just roll over either. For many politicians this made him quite an irritation, as all of his actions were clear-cut and dry. He actually used the taxes of those in his territory to improve the territory, and even went out of his way to lower the prices of items that were easy to obtain, while things like water and food were pretty much free. Compared to the selfish way that the vast majority of politicians governed, he was practically a saint, and it made them look very bad. The worst part for them, however, was that they all knew that they were powerless to take action against him. Embargoes, tariffs, or blockades. All useless, as Nick made sure his territory was self-sufficient. Military action? What a joke! Almost the entire population of his territory was armed with a Zanpakuto and thus highly dangerous. Propaganda and slurring his reputation was also off the table, because quite frankly Nick couldn't care less. All the usual ways they would work to suppress someone they didn't like were nullified preemptively, which made them frustrated. One might ask, what about assassination? But by this point in time the entire world knew how the last attempt at that had gone, and so it didn't even cross anyone's mind. There had been quite the amount of discord at the revelation that Nick wasn't human, or to be more specific, that he had discarded it willingly. A great many thought it a betrayal of his roots, but there were an equal amount that could understand why he did so as well. In this new world order it had been made blatantly clear that other magical species were superior to humans innately. It was a heavy blow to humanity's pride as the race that had for quite some time held absolute dominion over the world to learn that they were innately worse than nearly every other race on the planet. Those that denied this reality and still thought that humanity was the superior race rejected Nick for discarding it. The rest turned thoughtful instead about whether or not they too should discard their humanity and become something greater. This served to split the world into 3 rough mindsets: the evolutionists, the traditionalists, and the neutrals, who simply didn't care either way. This had caused a rise in deaths, unfortunately, as the 3 factions clashed since their views didn't mix at all. There was a bit of a problem with the evolutionist faction, however, as many of them sought out ways to grow beyond their humanity. Both good and bad methods were considered. Some of the more skilled wizards of that faction succeeded in their endeavors, while others merely turned into monsters from incorrect calculations or ingredients. A good example was an Egyptian wizard who tried to mix aspects of various magical beasts into himself to undergo a qualitative transformation, only to end up as a mass of feral parts that attacked everything around it. It was gruesome and took a lot of power to put down, as the magical beasts' combined resistances to magic and physical attacks gave the monster insane amounts of durability. Lupin had become a very popular choice for those seeking to become more than human, as his magic had settled after being held in place by the ring for so long. This meant that the man no longer needed the ring in order to be a perfect werewolf, and could even turn others into one as well. Most of those he had done so for were already werewolves, however, as he was trying his best to erase the curse entirely. Nick thought it a fool's errand, however, as many packs violently rejected the man, as they almost found the curse to be a sacred thing rather than a curse, and thus hated that he had corrupted it into what he did. Lupin was far too soft to kill these stubborn ones like he should, and as a result barely made a dent in the cursed werewolf population in the British Isles. The most irritating part in Nick's opinion was the evolutionists who sought him out for his method to go beyond the human race, as it was a tried and true method. Even after explaining that it was a series of fortunate events that couldn't be replicated, these people still didn't leave him alone and even tried to ambush him to collect samples from him in hopes of reverse engineering the process for themselves. Chapter 610, Restrictions. It took Nick a while, but he eventually managed to pass out a single believer's mark to every person in his territory, but finally he was ready to activate his tithe. His aura flared out in a golden red hue from his body before shrinking drastically to exactly 1% of its original size. Faithful tithe, collection. He shouted, and his ability activated. Immediately the marks in the possession of those in his territory shattered, and just under 22 million streaks of rainbow light shot into the sky and flew towards Nick's island like a reverse meteor shower. These lights ignored the wards and directly slammed into Nick's chest like drops of water, and immediately he began to absorb and refine this mana, causing his stores to rapidly balloon. A single mark gave a minuscule amount of mana like a drop of water, but 22 million marks was a flood. This was the beauty of this ability, it only showed its true value when used on a large group. Nick's mana stores rapidly grew to the halfway mark of tier 6 by the time his first tithe ended. He had to grab the balcony railing to stabilize himself afterwards, however, as a sense of weakness overcame him and he knew this was the backlash of using the ability. Nan was the life force of the body, so by effectively spending 99% of it on his ability, his body was drastically exhausted at the moment. He would recover in a few days after his body had time to adapt to the low level of energy it had in it at the moment. Is it wise to weaken your strongest form like this when Zeus could appear at any time? Hephaestus asked, concerned as she let him lean on her for support. Not to worry. I am not strong enough to win against him at the moment anyways, so I don't intend to confront him with this form but my other instead. Nick said reassuringly. I still don't like this plan of yours despite knowing that it won't actually be fatal to you. She said unhappily. Nick sighed. I would prefer not to do it either, but we need time for my power to grow and this has the best shot of giving it to us. He said helplessly. Hephaestus herself had confirmed that while Zeus was sneaky when he was at a disadvantage, employing underhanded and despicable methods to shake up his opponents, he also was bold when he felt he was at an advantage. She had witnessed this during the period that the gods were fighting the Titans in. This meant that they would be given no time to accumulate power once Zeus felt confident in being able to overpower them. That was where Nick's human body's ability came in, as at the moment of its death all his mana and aura would shoot into Zeus and explode. This definitely wouldn't be enough to kill Zeus, but it would be enough to make him cautious and unlikely to attack them openly again in case Nick could use the ability again. Nick couldn't, of course, nobody could, as that was one of the restrictions Nick placed on the ability. It could only be used once ever. No one else could replicate it even if they knew every detail about it due to this restriction. It was for this reason that Nick named the ability Taboo Calamity. While placing one's death as a prerequisite for an ability gave it a great increase in power, it wasn't enough to reach the level Nick wanted, so this restriction was added as well. This historical level limitation was so powerful that the ability crossed well into the divine as a result. In a related note, there was actually a person Nick had banned from learning Nan in fear of what they could accomplish with it, Hestia. The goddess held the sacrifice domain and as a result was likely the most uniquely suited to creating abilities with the power. She knew instinctively how potent a restriction would be and could undoubtedly get very creative with her restrictions to create terrifying abilities. Nick outright banned her from Nan as a result, to the point he had locked all tomes and knowledge of it in his realm where she had no hope of ever seeing it. Even further, those he unlocked the power in were sworn to secrecy and exclusivity via Daedric contracts, so they couldn't pass it to anyone else without permission. Anyways, Nick brought his now weakened body into the realm and switched over his focus to the human body as he waited for Zeus to pop up.
Thanks for listening.